So, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are zooming in from. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. And for those of you who have attended our series before, it's really good to have you back. I'm Dr. Megan Wong, a lecturer at the School of Law, University of Essex, and I'm also the director of the LLM in International Law and the co-founder and co-convener together with Dr. Emily Jones of this Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. It is my pleasure to be your host for today's event, which features a lecture by Professor Diane Otto entitled Rethinking International Law's Peace, a Queer Feminist Perspective, which will be chaired by Dr. Emily Jones. I will defer to Dr. Jones to introduce Professor Otto, but in my capacity as the host for today's excellent event, I would first like to say a few words about the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. Our lecture series was first inaugurated by Professor Niels Blokker, Chair of International Institutional Law at the University of Leiden and former Deputy Legal Advisor to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, earlier this year on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the first Security Council resolution. This series is built upon two important intellectual traditions of public international law: formalism and international legal practice, and international legal theory, including postcolonial and feminist perspectives. The idea for this series stems very much from our friendship and is inspired from our respect for each other's scholarship and research. We're both generalist public international lawyers with several specialist interests, but we write from different approaches. I'm a formalist and Dr. Jones is a critical legal scholar. And this series together brings what we hope is something for everyone. You can find the video recordings of our excellent speakers in the last spring term program and earlier this term on our webpage at the School of Law, as well as Professor Otto's lecture when the recording is processed will also be uploaded on the webpage. So please do check it out. And if I could just speak a little bit about this summer term. So this summer term, we have had the privilege of Professor Karen Knopp from the University of Toronto open our program as our first speaker of the term, followed by Professor Attila Tanzi, the Chair of International Law at the University of Bologna, and discussant Dr. Nilofer Oral, member of the UN International Law Commission, and the director of the Center for International Law, National University, Singapore. We also had Professor Naz Mordezadeh from Harvard Law School, Judge Ida Caracciolo from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and today we have Professor Diane Otto from Melbourne Law School. For the rest of our summer program, we have next week Osvaldo Urrutia, the legal advisor to Chile on fisheries and a lecturer at Universidad Católica de Valparaiso, Judge Eric Venestrom of the European Court of Human Rights, Professor Anne Orfid from also Melbourne Law School, and for our final session of the series, we have a panel comprising Judge Maria Teresa Infante Caffi from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, Professor Malgosia Fitzmaurice, Queen Mary University of London, Professor Fotini Pazartzis from National and Kapodistrian University of Athens and currently chair of the Human Rights Committee, Professor Patricia Gavo-Oteles, who's a member of the International Law Commission and the chair of the current drafting committee, and also a professor at the Autonomous University of Lisbon. So the registration for these events are up on our webpage, but also stay tuned on our social media for future announcements. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our chair, my friend and colleague, Dr. Emily Jones. Dr. Emily Jones is a lecturer in law at the University of Essex at the School of Law. She's a generalist public international lawyer specializing in gender and international law, science and technology and international law, and international environmental law. Dr. Jones recently published a co-authored book with Zed entitled The Law of War and Peace, A Gender Analysis, Volume 1. And her monograph, which is forthcoming and something we should all be looking forward to, entitled Feminist Theory in International Law, Post-Human Perspective, is forthcoming with Routledge's Glasshouse series. And now over to my formidable friend, my colleague, co-founder and co-convener, Dr. Emily Jones.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. It's always just such a pleasure to work with you on this series. And of course, it's my absolute pleasure today to be chairing this lecture by Professor Diane Otto, whose work has very much inspired my own for a long time. So I'm particularly proud to have her joining us today. And I'm sure many of you know Professor Otto already. She's one of the most prominent voices in feminist and queer scholarship and international law. But one of the things that I have personally always found very inspiring about her work is her constant commitment to intersectionality and to thinking who is excluded by and in international law, as well as also her commitment to thinking about international law differently, really in kind of new and different ways, which I personally really always enjoy. So, for example, her groundbreaking work on gender identity and international human rights law, which I first started reading actually as a student, really fundamentally changed the way that I saw international law. So she's long been an inspiration of mine, and I found her work both inspiring and exciting, and I have no doubt that today's lecture will follow in that suit. But of course, I should give you a more formal introduction to Professor Otto for you all. So I'll do that bit. Professor Diane Otto is a professorial fellow at Melbourne Law School, and she held the Francine V. McNiff Chair in Human Rights Law from 2013 to 16. Her research in the field of public international law and human rights law covers a broad field, including addressing gender and gender identity, sexuality and race inequalities in the context of international human rights law, the UN Security Council's peacekeeping work, the technologies of global crisis governance, threats to economic, social and cultural rights, and the transformative potential of people's tribunals and other NGO initiatives. So quite a wide array of work for those of you who are not familiar. And her recent publications obviously include Queering International Law, Possibilities, Alliances, Complicities and Risks, which came out in 2018 with Routledge. And it's a really fantastic collection of lots of different voices on queer approaches to international law. So I would highly recommend that you check that one out if you haven't already. And of course, today she will be speaking to the title of Rethinking International Law's Peace, a Queer Feminist Perspective. So very quick housekeeping rules before I pass over to our lecturer today. If you do want to ask a question, then please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can kind of see it. It's a little button that says Q&A. If you wish to remain anonymous, there is a little tab you can click to remain anonymous. So please do that. Otherwise, I may read out your name. So that's the housekeeping done. And without further ado, Professor Otto, over to you.
Thanks, Emily, and I hope I'm going to live up to those very high expectations. Thanks, Megan, for your introduction to the series, and hi, everyone. I'm going to start by reflecting. I know, it's hard to start in an informal way, but anyway, here we go. We are now living in the 2nd century of world wars and of global institutions that have peace as their professed goal. Now, originally, I planned to follow this opening sentence with a catalogue of the pervasiveness of killing and disabling force in today's world, but my list got very long, and I think that it's too easy to despair. And there are more hopeful stories to tell. So I start with history. Feminists have a long history of organising internationally for peace. They've strived for peace in a positive sense, not only as an absence of war, but also the realisation of social justice and equality for everyone. They've questioned the bright line that law has drawn between war and peace, arguing that killing, human suffering, and environmental destruction are not confined to armed conflict, and argued that we need to stop accepting everyday structural forms of violence as simply the way things are, what Maria Gran-Farley has called the politics of inevitability. This feminist heritage can be traced back to the resolutions adopted by the Hague Congress of Women in 1915, attended by women from across enemy lines who hoped to use their combined influence to bring World War I to a rapid conclusion. They established an international committee from which emerged the still active Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILF. Despite the reality that the practices of war have changed dramatically since 1915, the international feminist prescriptions have remained relatively unchanged. Universal disarmament, demilitarization, redistributive economics, and at least since the 1995 World Conference on Women, environmental sustainability. And lastly, an imperative to achieving all these goals, the dismantling of all peacetime structures of domination, not least hierarchies of gender, race, nation, and sexuality. One of the conundrums of feminist peace advocacy has, however, been how to theorise women's solidarity in the cause of peace without relying on maternalist representations of women. And Emily, can I ask you to put up the first slide here? So one of the conundrums has been how to theorise women's solidarity in the cause of peace without relying on maternalist representations of women as pacifying and civilising influences, which bear an unsettling resemblance to the representations of women in the gender stereotypes that sustain militarism and women's inequality. As you can see in this vintage poster, I think the very same image could support the women saying, "Don't go." Queer theory shares much with feminist conceptions of peace, drawing attention in perhaps a more expansive way to the harms that human bodies endure during times of peace as well as war, pointing to additional vectors of discrimination that mark certain bodies as less than fully human. What queer theory adds is the need to question orthodoxies of all kind, including feminist orthodoxies, to resist binary ways of thinking that have so distorted our relationships with each other and the non-human world, and celebrate instead the many different ways of being human. Queer thinking urges us to understand gender as multiple and shifting, to disrupt the male-female dualism that associates peace with femininity and weakness, and war with manliness and strength, and create a new starting point for solidarity between all gender identities in the cause of peace. By imagining peace as multi-gendered, the hope is to disempower the dualistic gendered underpinnings of mainstream conceptions of war and peace, and thereby shift the focus to nourishing life in all its forms. This is what I call a queer feminist approach. So, how is peace imagined in international law? And Emily, if we could go on to the next slide. I start with the story of peace told by the series of 4 stained glass windows which illuminate the largest courtroom in the Peace Palace in The Hague, used today, or at least before COVID, by the International Court of Justice. The Peace Palace was opened in 1913, just before the First World War. It was built to provide a home for the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which was created by the Hague Convention of 1899 for the Pacific settlement of international disputes. The story told by the windows reflects the thinking at the turn of the century that peace would eventually be achieved through the modern civilised practices of international legal or arbitral adjudication. The 4 windows are so 3 of them are sort of behind the lights, and the 4th one is behind the light on the far wall. They're entitled The Evolution of the Peace Ideal. Each of them depicts a phase in the development of peace, commencing with the primitive age, which marks the discovery of fire and metalworking, and helmeted figures appear in the background, foreshadowing the conflicts to come. There follows the other 3 windows in the series: the age of conquest, the present age. You'll be surprised to hear that the present age is no longer the age of conquest, and the final window portrays peace achieved, which, according to the inscription, marks, and I quote, the real beginning of man's higher development. The evolutionary narrative of Enlightenment Europe drives this story of peace. The inscription for the present age recognises war as a hindrance to progress, and peace in the final phase is represented as the ultimate sign of civilization, where judicialization, the practice of advanced scientific, rational, juridical, European thinking, can be relied upon to settle disputes. And of course, this story of peace relies completely on dualistic and hierarchical conceptions of gender and race. It is white men who are the central actors in all these phases. They're the protagonists of international wars, as well as those responsible for ending them. Jurists, diplomats, soldiers, philosophers, scientists, artists, and economic actors. Women are on the periphery, depicted mostly as caring for children, with allusions to the Virgin Mary and other saintly figures. The church-like form of the windows and many of their allegorical figures also serve to link Christianity with civilization and peace, erasing the inconvenient truth of Europe's deadly history of religious wars. In a similar vein, the preamble to the Hague Convention that established the court describes the goal of its signatories, who represent themselves or describe themselves as a community of civilized societies, to extend the empire of law to those men who, in the grand narrative of the windows, remain in the supposed backwardness and lawlessness of the primitive age or the age of consent. But what does it mean to treat peace as a story of progress, as achieved only when the men of the world become fully civilized? This evolutionary frame suggests that wars can be justified if waged against those less civilized and defended as having civilizing effects. This surely implicates the cause of peace in Europe's colonizations of the past and the neo-imperialism of the present. Thanks for taking the image away, Emily. What do you think would windows telling a queer feminist story of peace look like? I'll return to that. So turning then to peace as envisaged by the Charter of the United Nations. As you know, the maintenance of international peace and security is the UN's primary purpose. Yet the Charter is centrally concerned with armed conflict and its resolution, rather than peace in the queer feminist sense of nourishing life. Although it makes 45 references to peace, peace is not defined. And even former Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, in his 1992 post-Cold War agenda for peace, fails to provide a definition, instead merely referring to the concept of peace as easy to grasp. I wish it were so. In most of the Charter references, peace is coupled with security, signalling an understanding of peace reliant on military strength and securitized states, or as Judith Butler describes it, conceiving of peace through the frames of war. That the Charter's emphasis is on state security rather than on positive conceptions of peace that are concerned with the quality of everyone's life is signalled by the name of the organ entrusted with the main responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, the Security Council. Would things have turned out differently if the drafters had instead established a peace council? The mandate given to the Security Council includes the power to authorise the collective use of military force to enforce peace. To this end, permanent members of the Council are today among the world's largest arms producers, a fact that might, if this were a peace council, disqualify them from participation. The composition of the Council and its mandate reflects the view that aggression in international relations can only be contained or repressed by the threat and or the use of countervailing force. This model is based on assumptions about the inevitability of aggression in international society and the need for military strength to constrain such violence or act as a deterrent. What I think of as enforced peace One extreme example of which is provided by the many demilitarized zones, Emily, dotted around the world that are permanently patrolled by militaries, supervised in the main by the Security Council. Peace is understood as the absence of armed conflict, and militaries are required to maintain it. This is surely not what feminists have in mind when they call for demilitarization. And this is a picture of one of the signs marking the demilitarization zone on the Korean Peninsula. The international laws of war reflected in the UN Charter, thanks Emily, we can stop sharing, also constitute peace through the frames of war. Significantly, the use of military force is prohibited, but there are exceptions, and lawyers know a lot about the elasticity of exceptions. In addition to the Security Council authorization, the primary exception is the use of force in self-defense, allowed, in the words of the Charter, if necessitated by an imminent armed attack. Yet exceptions have multiplied since 1945, and many earlier restrictions on the use of force have been watered down, sometimes appropriating feminist concerns to legitimate this. For example, the US invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 was justified partly as a measure to liberate women. And the Security Council has suggested in two of its Women, Peace and Security resolutions that armed intervention to rescue women from sexual attack may also become more acceptable, stretching the requirement of an imminent attack almost beyond recognition. At the same time as international laws aimed at war's elimination have been progressively weakened, efforts to strengthen those laws aimed at humanizing the conduct of war, euphemistically called international humanitarian law, have multiplied. These laws aim to protect certain categories of people during armed conflict, and they also seek to limit the means and methods of warfare. But the limits placed on attacking civilians have in practice almost entirely disappeared, as we saw recently in Gaza. And while banning the use of chemical weapons and landmines are surely welcome developments, the effect is to endorse the use of weapons which are not banned. Many critical scholars have rightly argued that these laws actually work against peace by legitimizing armed conflict so long as it plays by the rules. That states have failed to outlaw nuclear weapons and prevent their spread, threatening not only human life, but the planet itself, becomes unfathomable the moment one steps outside the frames of war. Questions about the continuing relevance of international humanitarian law in 2019, 70 years after the adoption of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, were fixated on the changing means and methods of warfare rather than by any evolutionary shift towards ending armed conflict, despite the present age claim of the Peace Palace stained glass windows to increased peaceful resolution of disputes. Nor is there any evidence that war is a hindrance to progress, as in the evolutionary peace story. To the contrary, armed conflict has become one of the engines of so-called progress, with arms sales soaring, new investments in the development of nuclear and other weapons, and lethal technologies of war, and many states, including Australia, expanding their arms industries and exports in the hope of joining the big boys club of major arms exporters. That's pretty depressing. So what story is told then by the remaining references to peace in the UN Charter that are not coupled with security? Do they provide a starting point for imagining peace outside the frames of war and creating the conditions of possibility for non-violence and an appreciation of the equal value of every human life? A close examination of the Charter's non-securitized prescriptions for peace revealed that they rely heavily on a narrative of progress, like the story told by the Peace Palace's windows. Peace is associated with creating conditions of economic and social progress and development, with promoting universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, which, as Ratna Kapoor argues, operates more as a project of governance rather than emancipation, and with administering colonial territories whose people have not yet attained full measure of self-government and need assistance with political, economic, social, and educational advancement. Thus, in the Charter's prescription, it is still only fully civilized peoples who are thought to be capable of living together in peace. As conditions have changed since 1945, aspects of the progress narrative have shifted, but the main story has remained the same. At the end of the Cold War, for example, free market globalization was heralded as a primary route to peace, and renewed emphasis was placed on spreading democracy and human rights, as well as expanding the markets in arms. Since 9/11, peace has necessitated increased securitization of many borders and of our everyday lives, and certain new human rights abuses have become routine, justified by stories of threat from unenlightened, uncivilized, racialized others, including Muslim veil-wearing women. Liberal ideas about evolutionary peace have brought us to this juncture. Within Marxism too, the idea that progress will lead to the emergence of a non-violent world order after the socialist revolution has always had a firm grip. These narratives of civilizational progress have failed us all because they've served repeatedly to reimpose imperial relations of domination in new disguise, despite many efforts by activists and scholars to dislodge peace from these shackles. And now we have a public health crisis identified as a war, securitizing the COVID-19 pandemic and legitimating an extension of executive powers of surveillance, policing, and border controls everywhere. This approach further entrenches inequality and hostile nationalistic fervour. As Christine Schwabel-Patel argues, we don't need a war against coronavirus, we need solidarity. We need to recognise our global interrelatedness and our obligations to each other beyond the exclusionary loyalties of family, racial group, nation, and perceptions of evolutionary advancement by urgently attending to neglected public health systems and working collectively to ensure that healthcare, knowledge, and resources are distributed in a way that values every human life equally. For this, we need the cooperative framework of the World Health Organization, not the Security Council's imperial logic of war. So what do imaginaries of peace start to look like if we refuse to conceive of peace through the dualistically gendered and hierarchical frames of evolution and war? What would a world and its laws devoted to sustaining and enriching all life, human and non-human, look like? Emily? American poet, political activist, and feminist Muriel Rukeyser said in a reflection on peace and poetry that she wrote in 1949, "To be against war is not enough. It is hardly a beginning. We are against war and the sources of war. We are for poetry and the sources of poetry. They are everyday, these sources, as the sources of peace are everyday, infinite and commonplace as a look, as each new sun." As Rukeyser suggests, sources of peace lie in the everyday, in our homes and communities, in our daily words and actions. We can challenge the politics of inevitability. For instance, we can refuse the militarization of our own everyday lives. I first realised this when I read Cynthia Enlow's provocation entitled, "How do they militarize a can of soup?" which was published in 2000. She was reflecting on a can of Heinz tomato soup, which she'd purchased in London during the Thatcher years in the 1980s. The soup was designed to be more appealing to children and thus to their mothers by containing noodles shaped like Star Wars weapons. Emily, next slide. The sheer pervasiveness of military symbols and representations incorporated into the everyday is breathtaking. Thanks, Emily. Mother and baby matching outfits, marketed as toys. And Emily, the next slide. Even camouflage condoms marketed by a barely disguised nod to rape. Emily, I know why you might not want to put this slide up, but let's do it. Militarism, supported by international law, cements the privileging of certain types of racialized, heteronormative masculinity, harmful masculinities that valorize violence and aggression as a sign of strength and dismiss anti-militarism as a sign of weakness, read femininity, of wimpishness, read failed masculinity or homosexuality, or a sign of backness, read not yet fully civilized. Gender, sexual and racial stereotypes fundamentally shape how business as usual occurs in the militarized settlement of international disputes. These stereotypes work to preemptively dismiss many possible modes of non-violent conflict resolution because they're not considered manly enough. They shape the politics of inevitability. Emily, you can remove that slide now, thanks. The many collective practices of peace all around us are seldom reported in the press. When they are all too often maligned as threatening, criminal, treasonous, terrorist, or, can we share the next slide? Or hysterical, queer, and aggressive, as in the case of Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which after a 19-year protest finally saw the removal of nuclear-powered NATO cruise missiles from the military base in the centre of England, returned to the US. The women's non-violent demonstration built on earlier genealogies of feminist resistance and imagined radical equality. Their actions challenged traditional stereotypes of women, pioneered new practices of support and solidarity, made decisions collectively, and forged innovative ways to communicate and practice nonviolent protest. During the latest Israel-Palestine bombings, there was total press silence about the Jewish and Palestinian Israelis who protested the escalation of the conflict together. A brave and powerful refusal to recognise enemy lines. Another example, Emily, move on to the next slide, is Jinwa Free Women's Village in northern Syria. And Jinwa is Kurdish for women's land, which opens its doors in 2018 to provide a space of safety and freedom for Arab, Kurdish, Yazidi, and other women and their children fleeing Islamic State. And the village still operates and is in the process of expansion. There are thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of other instances of community-based groups, often supported transnationally, imagining, working for, building and living peace outside the frames of civilizational evolution and of war, and without state or institutional authorization. Among them are hundreds of women's groups in post-conflict societies trying to utilize Security Council's women, peace and security agenda as leverage for feminist change. Peace communities in Colombia, which ban weapons and farm the land using traditional weapons that are sustainable and environmentally friendly. Local chapters of WILF still organising to promote disarmament and demilitarisation. Queer Jewish groups working with Palestinians to bring the Israeli occupation to an end. Queer groups in Lebanon providing refuge for queer Syrians who fled both their state and fundamentalist militias. Women in Black, first established in Israel in 1988, now holding silent vigils around the world opposing occupation and war. And women's and people's tribunals, where the stories of suffering and injustice, as well as resistance and survival, not recognised by the laws of the state or the international community, can be heard and acknowledged. In denigrating these practices of peace as unpatriotic and dangerous, like the criminalisation and stigmatisation of homosexuality, such communities are rendered less than fully human, and they become legitimate trying to disrupt business as usual are in great danger, as the price of refusing to accept the politics of inevitability is high, for now at least. We need many peace councils and international laws that support and celebrate such movements for change. In international law, peace must be dislodged from the shackles of war and hierarchy before it will be possible for law to recognise and strengthen the everyday practices of peace all around us. To do this, we need to build on the small seeds of resistance that have been left as traces in international law and politics. We need to make the most that we possibly can of those traces that linger, for example, in the Secretary-General's 2018 Agenda for Disarmament, and work to strengthen the precarious footholds feminists have forged in many areas of law. The barely legible protections for queer bodies in human rights law and the remnants of postcoloniality from earlier times. At the same time, we need to find bolder ways to embody and live peace in solidarity with all those many others who are rethinking peace, whether they are trying to recover from armed conflict like the women of Jinhua, to prevent armed conflict like the Greenham Common women, to resist armed conflict like the Colombian peace communities, and in so-called times of peace, to stop the daily violences that are accepted as inevitable. The evolutionary militaristic stories of peace need to be replaced by stories that help us to imagine and create conditions that will make the response of violence unintelligible. To do this, we need to draw on all the resources at our disposal, including the rich histories of feminist imaginaries of permanent peace, third world visions of cooperation and friendly relations and a new international economic order, Indigenous relations of interconnectedness between people and land and future generations, queer dreams of challenging orthodoxies and eliminating dualistic prescriptions of gender and sexuality, and on poetry, along with Muriel, in order to create a world in which every life matters. Peace is not passivity. The potential for violence will always exist in our personal and our public lives. Peace requires ongoing efforts to resist hierarchy, inequality, and violence in all its forms. What would windows telling a queer feminist story of peace look like? I'm not sure that we know how to think about peace through the frames of life. The frames of war have been so totalizing, nor how to recognise human kinship that extends beyond family, race, nation, religion, and relative privilege. But I would settle for now for windows that enabled us to see that nothing is inevitable, that we have the power together to challenge the orthodoxies that divide and hierarchize us, and to find new ways to resolve conflict without violence.
I just wanted to thank you on behalf of Dr. Wong and myself for that fantastic lecture. It was really great to have you join us, and yeah, to just learn from you and listen further to come up with some of your ongoing work. So thank you very much.